The latest CAP reform is an important one. For the first time in history, gender has been added as part of the 10 specific goals of the CAP for this programming period. While it is a clear step in the right direction, it is nowhere near enough, especially if we want a CAP that truly transforms rural gender relations. As part of Horizon Project SWIFT, our team at Wageningen conducted a feminist policy analysis of the latest CAP reform, which is set to be in effect from 2023 until 2027. In 2027, there will be a new CAP reform, and with it, a renewed opportunity to further push for the inclusion of gender. The results of our analysis show that the way gender is introduced into the CAP, as of now, resembles more something which we call institutional layering rather than gender mainstreaming, which would be the ideal situation wherein gender is included at every stage of the policy cycle. But what do I mean by institutional layering? It means that this newly added gender element is thrown onto an existing policy framework, but without really questioning how it interacts with the remainder of the policy. So what led us to this conclusion? Through the systematic identification of contradictions within the CAP, which lead to potential structural barriers for women farmers, we have identified the ways in which the CAP shapes behavior as repetitive and different depending on the person's gender ways. In other words, the CAP is a gendered institution. More specifically, in the latest CAP reform, the few provisions that do target women are either non-obligatory or focus merely on monitoring gender, for example, with indicators related to that. Furthermore, monitoring gender is not the same as doing gender, and it should not be confused with incorporating this data into the next policy reform. Lastly, the CAP views gender to mean women and women to be a homogeneous group. Both of these premises are false, and therefore the CAP fails to take an intersectional approach. Earlier I spoke of institutional layering. While the literature argues that on its own it's not enough to cause any real change, it does agree on one thing, that it can provide hooking points that future reform can latch itself onto. But for the time being, there is a clear mismatch between policy intention and policy practice, and we have some recommendation if we are to start to get over this mismatch. First, to not just feature gender equality, but to make it its own CAP goal. Currently, it shares specific Objective 8 with a myriad of other socially oriented goals. Second, for the EU to recognize that sex and gender disaggregated data is a means and not an end to gender equality. To ensure not just the quality and relevance of data, but also its integration into the policy, and not just involuntary measures. Third, to introduce more CAP indicators that capture gender differences. Fourth, to take into account structural inequalities that might underlie access to subsidies. Fifth, an observatory should be established to monitor social conditionality and ensure that this innovation functions to protect agricultural workers, as it was intended to. So far, it has the potential to make the CAP more intersectional, but it does not go far enough in terms of scope or in terms of level of sanctions. Sixth, we need diverse representations across approved advisors providing advisory services. And lastly, we need hard quotas to ensure that all committees related to CAP processes reach gender parity.